So Canada just did something that in any sane world would be front page news. While Vladimir Putin is out here saying he's ready for war with Europe, and Donald Trump is talking about missile strikes in Venezuela like he's announcing a new golf course, Canada quietly walked into Brussels and said, "We're in."
Not in a nice statement, strong concerns kind of way. In the money, in the contracts, in the supply chains. For the first time ever, a country outside the European Union is joining their flagship defense program. And that country isn't the USA, it isn't the UK, it's us, the allegedly harmless neighbor that just signed up for Europe's hardcore defense club.
The program is called SAFE, Security Action for Europe. 150 billion euros. It's joint procurement of missiles, drones, artillery systems, infantry weapons, air defense, cyber tools, the works.
And now Canada has the membership card. Prime Minister Mark Carney posted on Facebook, "In a dangerous and divided world, Canada and Europe are elevating our defense partnership."
We're no longer just a customer at the edge of the table. We're buying in with everyone else.
Now, before we get started, we have a question for you. Should Canada keep relying on the US for its security?
Or was joining Europe's defense program the first genuinely sensible thing we've done in years? Let us know in the comments because we want to hear from you.
All right, now let's look at this pivot to Europe. It wasn't as weird as people make it sound. You know, everybody jokes that we're an ocean apart, but we actually share two borders with the EU.
Hans Island, which is a tiny rock in the Arctic that Canada and Greenland literally split down the middle. Same landmass, one half Canada, one half Denmark, meaning one half of that rock is technically in the European Union.
And there's Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, a French territory you can reach by a short ferry ride from Newfoundland. It's about as easy as popping over to PEI from New Brunswick.
So when people act surprised that Canada is teaming up with Europe, the punchline is that we're already neighbors. Frozen neighbors, but neighbors.
And now that geography's picking up the phone, our companies are getting through to Europe as well. Canada can now compete for those contracts, ammunition, missiles, drones, artillery, infantry, weapons, and electronics. If we play this right, that's billions of dollars in potential deals. Real jobs in Canadian factories and faster gear for our own troops.
Meanwhile, Trump is bragging about blowing up boats off of Venezuela and hinting at land strikes very soon.
So on one screen, you've got Putin telling Europe he's ready for war if they start it, and Trump promising to take those sons of bitches out in Venezuela and any other country that he blames for drugs. And on our screens, well, we see Canada quietly signing to Europe's defense fund, and we're saying, we're going to spend less of our military budget in the USA.
You don't have to be a strategist to see the theme going on here, right? The grown-up conversation of scary times call for serious measures is that Canada cannot afford to have our entire security architecture dependent on whoever is yelling in a microphone in Washington this week.
So in this video, we're going to unpack what SAFE actually is, why Canada joining is a huge deal, and how it ties into Putin's threats against Europe, and why Trump's Venezuela obsession is freaking out both Democrats and Republicans and Canadians.
Let's start with SAFE. Security Action for Europe. The basic idea is pretty simple. Europe finally realized that the patchwork defense spending and 27 different shopping lists are a great way to waste money and show up unprepared. So they built a giant procurement pot, up to 150 billion euros to ramp up production of everything they're burning through in Ukraine and everything they might need if Putin pushes further.
Instead of one country ordering 500 missiles and another ordering 300 and everyone paying a premium, SAFE lets them go to manufacturers and say, here's a giant order. Give us scale, give us speed, and we'll coordinate the production lines. You cut costs, you stabilize the industry, and you're not sitting there begging for the US to ship you leftovers from their own stockpile.
Canada joining means that we get to walk through that door too. Defense Minister David McGuinty says we've negotiated our way into the tent. We pay an initial entrance fee, about 10 million euros, and then that gets adjusted later based on how many contracts Canadian industry actually wins.
That's the key part a lot of people are missing. This isn't about wiring 150 billion euros to Brussels because we have a crush on Ursula von der Leyen. The fund already exists. The question is whether Canadian companies can get to compete inside it or watch from the outside while everyone else arms up.
So when you see people in the Financial Post comments saying, just more wasted taxpayers' money, it sounds satisfying, but it's also wrong. We're not paying for the whole thing. We're buying a ticket to the marketplace. If our companies land huge contracts, yeah, our contribution goes up, but so do the jobs and the tax receipts at home.
If we want a serious defense industry, we need markets. Europe is building one, and we just bought our way in.
Now, why is Prime Minister Carney doing this? Because for decades we spent roughly 3/4 of our defense capital in the US. We bought American jets, American helicopters, American artillery, American everything, which was fine when the US was a reasonably predictable partner.
Fast forward to now with Trump back in the White House. Gosh, this guy is running boat strikes off Venezuela without Congress, bragging about killing survivors in the water. He's sidelining European leaders in Ukraine peace talks, calling Somali immigrants garbage and telling them to leave the country. He's dragging an entire community through mud in front of cameras. It's chaos abroad and contempt at home.
So Carney's looking at this and going, well, maybe, just maybe, we should not have our entire military supply chain tied to that.
So earlier this year, Carney signed a security defense partnership with the EU. It's the political handshake that said both sides were ready to build something bigger together. And SAFE is the actual machinery of that promise. This is where the money flows, the contracts get written, and the supply chains get stitched together. Less cash heading south and more of it landing in a network where Canada actually has some leverage.
And that matters for our sovereignty. If your jets, your missiles, your communications gear, your spare parts all come from one country, that country effectively has veto on your foreign policy. They can delay, they can block, they can tie you up in export controls. So if you try to sell your own kit to someone else, suddenly it's, sorry, the license doesn't allow that.
With SAFE, we're not magically free from all of that, but we are less exposed. We're part of a system where we're not just a customer at the end of the chain. We're a producer, a partner, and a buyer.
And this is exactly why pouring every last dollar into the F-35 isn't the smartest long-term plan. The Americans control the software, the upgrades, the parts, the resale rules. If Washington sneezes, basically our fleet gets pneumonia.
And that's why Sweden's deal is so sweet. They didn't just offer us Gripens, they offered the whole package. Build them here with Bombardier, full tech transfer, Canadian control over maintenance and upgrades, and training our pilots and technicians on Canadian soil.
So maybe we stop acting like the F-35 is the only option on the menu. If you want to hear more about the Gripens, make sure to watch our video in the links below.
Now, let's talk about the part that should keep people up at night, Russia. Because SAFE didn't appear out of thin air. It came directly out of the war in Ukraine and the realization that Europe had hollowed out its own defenses.
Putin has spent the last few years pushing the line and watching who blinks. The latest round of peace talks hasn't solved anything. There's a draft plan. Ukraine and Europe tried to toughen that up, but Russia wants territory and weaker guarantees. And in the middle of that, Putin gets in front of the cameras and says, we're not going to war with Europe, but if Europe wants a fight and it starts it, we're ready right now.
That's not subtle at all. While he's saying that, Russia keeps grinding away at Ukraine's energy infrastructure and dragging this process out. Because a long war works for Putin. It keeps Ukraine bleeding and Europe nervous.
So Europe looked at that, looked at their ammo stockpiles, their half-broken procurement systems, and said, okay, enough. SAFE is their attempt to make sure that if Putin does test NATO or an EU state directly, they're not standing there with empty warehouses and strongly worded press releases. It also signals something else. Canada is picking a side. We're not neutral. We're not shrugging and saying, oh, this is far away. Ukraine isn't some random conflict on the other side of the planet. It's a country that was invaded by a nuclear power for daring to exist outside of Moscow's control. If we don't stand up for that, what message does that send about our own sovereignty? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If Putin thinks he can grab territory without consequences and Trump, who practically treats Putin like a mentor, decides Canada's too independent for his liking, who exactly is going to draw the line?
Especially now when the guy in the Oval Office can barely finish a sentence about Ukraine without checking how it will land in Moscow. Trump talks about Putin like he's reviewing a luxury resort. Strong leader, very impressive, really knows what he wants. If Putin ever wrote a thank you card to him, well, Trump would frame it.
So when Canada backs Ukraine, we're not just helping an ally, we're drawing a line that Trump refuses to draw. Because every time Putin pushes and Trump applauds, it sends a message. If you're a small or a medium-sized democracy, don't expect Washington to stand up for you. And if that's the new U.S. foreign policy, then Canada needs friends who actually believe in sovereignty.
So yes, we're picking a side. The side that doesn't reward invasions. The side that doesn't wink at dictators. The side that understands if Ukraine falls, the whole system that protects countries like ours gets weaker.
Now, let's shift to Venezuela. Since early September, U.S. forces have carried out at least 21 strikes on what they call drug boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. At least 83 people have been killed. The White House says they're targeting smugglers. Venezuela says this is a pretext to attack its government. Either way, people are dying in international waters without any public debate. And Trump's response at a cabinet meeting was essentially, "We're saving lives." He said every boat they blow up saves 25,000 American lives from drugs. Where the heck did he get that number from? And then he bragged about taking those sons of bitches out. And then he went even further. He floated the idea of striking any country he blames for drug production, not just Venezuela.
Scary. Because remember, this is the same guy who claimed drugs were pouring in from Canada, which was total fiction. We were talking about under 50 pounds a year. And he used that made-up emergency to slap tariffs on us. That wasn't about drugs. It was about punishment and leverage. So what's next?
I don't know, and that is actually what keeps me up at night. If he's willing to weaponize a fake drug crisis against Canada once, what is going to stop him from doing it again? What stops him from pointing at Nova Scotia or Newfoundland fishermen and saying, "See? More threats to America," and using it as cover to grab whatever resource he wants next?
When someone is that reckless, that impulsive, and that eager to turn lies into policy, geography stops being a safety net. We can't just assume he'll keep the chaos on his side of the border. If he invents a threat, he'll act on it like he already did.
So imagine you're sitting in Ottawa watching all of this. One superpower is threatening Europe and grinding Ukraine into the mud. The other is bragging about boat strikes, hinting at land strikes very soon, and only being restrained because Congress is frantically trying to claw back its constitutional role.
This is the backdrop to Canada joining SAFE. It's not just buying cheaper shells. It's about not tying our security entirely to a country whose president might wake up one morning and decide that our trade policy, our immigration policy, our climate policy is grounds for consequences.
Because once you're in that situation, all the nice rhetoric about allies and shared values collapses into one hard question. Who controls the spare parts?
SAFE changes the math a bit. If we buy from Europe, we're not just getting gear, we're buying our way deeper into a system that buys from us too. That's a very different conversation than, please take our money and then threaten us with tariffs if we annoy you.
So here's where we land. Canada just became the first non-EU member of Europe's biggest defense program. The UK walked away, and we walked in. Putin is testing Europe, Trump is testing Venezuela, and Congress is scrambling to stop him from expanding it into a full-blown war without approval.
Carney is betting that the way to protect Canada and that world is not to cling tighter to Washington, but to anchor ourselves more tightly to Europe, support Ukraine, and build our own industrial muscle at home. It's a gamble, but doing nothing was also a gamble.
So the question now isn't whether this was symbolic. It wasn't. The question is whether we follow through. Do we actually hit the defense targets? Do we build capacity in Canada instead of just feeding foreign contractors? Do we keep standing with Ukraine even when it gets less fashionable?
We're going to keep watching this, and we're going to track the contracts, the spending, the Ukraine support, and yes, what Trump does next in Venezuela and beyond.
So let us know in the comments. What do you think? Is joining SAFE the right move, or is Canada getting dragged into something that we're not ready for?
If you found this helpful, hit like, share it with the one friend who still thinks Canada has to stay neutral, and make sure you're subscribed and click on that bell. We're not done with this story, and Europe is rearming, Trump is escalating, and Canada just picked a side.
We'll see you next time. Until then, keep your elbows up and your facts straight. And don't forget, All this month, we've released a charity collection on our merch store where 100% of the profits go to charity. So if you feel like helping out this holiday season, check it out. Links are in the description.
See you tomorrow, everyone.
Ciao for now.